tricky stuff.
I will say like one thing that I actually enjoy about this assessment is that I trust science like way less now. Like, let me explain. So like before for other courses, right? Or like when we usually read articles online, we don't read the full thing, or we just read abstract, or we take it for granted. Yeah, we just look at the results and we're like, okay, yeah, the normal is there, it's all good. But then like right now when we like, replicate it, we're like, why are they using like normal distribution instead of like binomial? Like
a million questions come up.
But the experts have no idea what they're doing too.
Yes.
So that's good.
Yes, it's a very humbling experience. You get to learn a lot about the inner workings of science, how messy everything is. So hopefully by the end of the semester, you'll have more humility, and it's good to be skeptical. It's good to come to things with a critical mindset. Doesn't mean that everything is bad or everything is negative, but a lot of it is. We don't discuss this in this course, but in the other course in advanced social psychology, we discuss a lot of the problems right now in science. Some of the problems with replication, some of the problems with reproducibility, some of the problems with sometimes fraud. So I don't have the time to discuss all these things with you. I'll occasionally mention some of the projects that we do, but if you want to know more about that, then perhaps next year you're welcome to join me or watch some of the videos. There's even like a lecture about like 40 minutes that you can go into, but that's a different thing. But it's really good for you to know these things, and also to think, if you're a scientist or if you go to industry and you do your own projects with data, how to make sure that everything that you do is clear, reproducible, replicable, that everybody understands, how to communicate to managers, how to communicate to practitioners. This is really important stuff. So it's better for you to go through this now than go through this when you're actually in industry or academia later on in your life. I know it feels perhaps painful or pressure. I hope never gets to this kind of bad, but it's good. I do want to say, I think I tried to keep saying this again and again, but we're really here to help you. So we try and provide as many videos as we can. The team really wants to help you on Slack or in your tutorials. So if you have issues or if you're feeling pressure or something doesn't make sense, I don't want you to go, entire nights and weekends. And you're supposed to sleep. You're supposed to have a weekend for yourself to go hiking in Hong Kong or whatever. I want you to communicate things before it gets too bad. So if you've invested, I don't know, an hour to sort out OSF, and something is not working, communicate this to us. And for us, it's very clear. We'll tell you what the answer is. We'll do our best. I try to be very responsive, although of course there's lots of you and there's other courses. So I try, and the teaching assistants help me a lot with this. So do tell us what your trouble is, and we'll try to help you. All right, so that's kind of like an interesting opening to this session, but it's good that you told me about this. I got some mentors for us because we're gonna play some games today. So hopefully that will sweeten up things for you. I'll go straight into the beginning. This, we went through this sort of thing. We talked about all sorts of heuristics and biases. We played some games that got you an understanding of what experimental design is. So we did game theory stuff. Started from the dictator game through the trust game, ultimatum game, out of games in order to try and gain some understanding of our irrational mind. And so there's the Homo economicus that acts very rationally and acts a certain way, but then we realize that perhaps we do things differently. We have emotions, we have instincts, we have intuitions. And the question is, are we like Homer Simpson? Is Simpson still running? I think it is running, right? Like, I don't know, season 50 something. There's all these explanations about system 1, system 2. We're not going to go into this in depth. One of them is the more deliberate. One of them is the more intuitive. These are the main books that we keep covering and coming back to. I think we discussed a little bit about thinking fast and slow. So this is definitely a main book in our field, following the Nobel Prize by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, was also alive, he would also receive the Nobel Prize together with Daniel Kahneman. Misbehaving is Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2017. And he joined together with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Back then in economics, to join with psychologists was considered to be blasphemy, forbidden. Do not do this. You're not supposed to talk to psychologists because we have these nice models. But he did this. If you want to learn about their personal stories, which I think are fascinating, then Michael Lewis, who has a lot of New York Times bestsellers, The Big Short, a bunch of them, Moneyball, actually decided to write a book about their lives, which is remarkable. So a lot of things that I like about this book, he tells about how Daniel Kahneman, who is a Holocaust survivor from France, met Amos Tversky, who was considered an Israeli war hero slash genius, but they were very different people. One is very introverted, one is very extroverted, and it's quite amazing that they came together to come up with this heuristics biases path. And then later on, Richard Thaler, who was very disappointed with economics, kind of joined them into making what is behavioral economics. So a lot of the things that I'm going to show you today are based on Kahneman and Tversky's work. Later on, we'll also get to Richard Thaler. Plus, if you want this to be communicated in a more day-to-day language, then Dan Ariely does a pretty good job. And later on, we'll see another video from Dan Ariely. So we'll start with a little demonstration, which will also allow us to understand a little bit, because we don't get to talk a lot about statistics and research design. So I'm going to do this very briefly using examples here. So we're going to test this on ourselves. I'm going to open the Mentimeter for us to start this. So I'll ask you to go on the Mentimeter and punch in this code 49152345. And I'm going to read this together with you. This is a very simple scenario, and this is from a paper by Kahneman and Tversky, something called the exceptionality effect. So one of the nice things that I really think contributed to them being cited so many times and them being impactful many times is because they basically, in the books, tells the story about how they did this. They came into a room and together thought about how to best demonstrate an effect. And they did this using scenarios like this, very, very simple scenarios. I think anybody can understand. You can give this to your parents or your friends, and immediately they will be able to understand the scenario and react to it. And together we'll try and understand, is there a pattern here? Is there something going on in this kind of scenario? So as you're answering this, try and also think, what is your prediction about how people will answer? Okay, so here we go. Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith. Mr. Jones almost never takes hitchhikers in his car. Yesterday, he gave a man a ride and was robbed. Mr. Smith frequently takes hitchhikers in his car. Yesterday, he gave a man a ride and was robbed. So both of them decided to give a ride, and both of them were robbed. But one of them never takes hitchhikers, and one of them frequently takes hitchhikers. Now, who do you think will experience greater regret over being robbed? Is it Mr. Jones or is it Mr. Smith, the person who never takes hitchhikers or the person that frequently takes hitchhikers? Before I share the results, do you have any intuitions about which one tends to regret more? Mr. Jones never takes hitchhikers. Why?
Because I think it's maybe about the base rate. Because Mr. Jones will have an experience where out of like the very few people he took in his car, I think one of them robbed him.
Mm-hmm.
So that the percentage of people who he gave a ride for and was robbed is much larger than this. So you might have a more negative percentage of giving people rides and stuff like that.
Okay, so you mentioned two things. One is the base rate of how frequently he usually does this sort of thing. So his past behavior, whether he takes hitchhikers or not. The second thing is about the proportion in relation to that, right? All right. So Nobel Prize for you. Here we go. So Mr. Jones, it usually never is like 90, 100%, but this comes pretty close. So in an average classroom, this is pretty much what we would expect. So 11 versus 3. Let's see. Another similar scenario, but slightly different because this one has a scale. Similar scenario, 2 convenience stores are located in Mr. Paul's neighborhood. He frequents store A more regularly than store B. Last night he visited store A. He walked in on a robbery taking place at the store and was shot. So once again, we have unusual, these circumstances that are on. The circumstances where something negative happens, and then he lost the use of his right arm as a result of the gunshot wound. Assume that there is no compensation given to Mr. Paul. How much regret does he feel about visiting store A? So here, rather than choosing between 2 people, I'm asking you to just rate this person from 0 to 4. Now, the following one is very, very similar. In the first one, we had Mr. Paul. Now we have Mr. George. So we're evaluating them separately. Mr. George also frequents store A more regularly than he frequents store B. Last night he visited store B. So in the first one, he visited store A, which is the more frequent one. In the second one, he visited the less frequent one. So he walked in on a robbery taking place at the store and was shot. Exactly the same circumstances. How much regret does he feel about visiting store B? So if we look at the first pattern compared to the second pattern, now instead of seeing this in exactly the same question, one against the other, we have 2 different questions and a scale. So rather than a dichotomous scale, we're talking about a continuous scale. So we'll look at. So here we have a measure that's continuous. So the regret about visiting store A, which is the more frequent store. And then we have the other one, which has much higher regret. So it's very similar to the first question, only here we had 2 different questions. Now, first of all, this is a successful replication of their paper. I'm going to discuss what that paper says. But before that, I want to tell you something about the 2 designs here. How would you describe the first design, the first problem that we had? So this problem. This problem. How would you describe this kind of design? Okay, yeah. Yeah, so here we have a choice, right? So we presented it with both of them together. And in the other one, we have each of them separately. So in some of the projects that you will have 1 of 2 options, and then we're looking at proportions. So how many people chose this and how many chose this. But in these kinds of designs, when we're talking about the second kind of design, first of all, it's called a within subject design because all of you answered both. Typically, we randomize the order. We switch the order so that we control the noise. So we want to make sure it's not because it's the first, because sometimes it's the second. So that's why it's very important that we have randomization of the order. But then we want to compare these 2, one against the other. So if we have only 2 conditions, and this is a within design, typically what is the statistical test that you run for this? Yeah, paired sample t-test, very, very good. We'll call this dependent sample t-test. So usually this leads to a p-value. So there's the t-statistics and a p-value. And then from that, we compute what is called a standardized effect of Cohen's d, or in this case, because it's a within design, Cohen's d z. And from that, we can assume all sorts of things of whether this is, whether we were able to detect differences and reject the null hypothesis. And over here, it really seems, because we have 11 over here and the mean is 3.8, that it seems like it's on the right direction to be more significant than 2.8. Because this is a very small sample, it's difficult to know whether this is significant or not, but there's definitely an effect that we can see here that's visible. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this to you and why I'm starting from this before we go on to more complicated replications is because actually this was the first replication that I ever did in my life. So in 2016, I joined postdoc in Maastricht University, and I had no idea what replications are. I had no idea what a pre-registration is. And I just felt like I want to switch from everything that I'm doing in psychology to something that I believe is more solid. So I did stuff about belief in free will. I did stuff on personal values. I did stuff on all sorts of other domains. I decided to put all this aside because of all sorts of things that are happening in science that we discuss in advanced social psychology about the replication crisis and all sorts of things. And I decided I'm going to gamble on Kahneman and Tversky being more reliable. But I want to test this intuition. I want to really make sure the judgment and decision making is solid. But looking at all the complicated stuff in judgment decision making, I decided I want to start from the very basic paradigm. And you saw just how simple it is. The scenario, two choices. It doesn't get much simpler than that. And then if you want to complicate this a little bit more, then you can do a within subject design and then a continuous variable, and still very, very simple t-test. Most of the replications that you'll be looking at actually have a little bit more than that. So usually they have an ANOVA, maybe 3 conditions, or a 2x2. So there's something that kind of complicates this a little bit more. But before I go into all the complications, I wanted to start from something very basic. So I went and looked at Kahneman. So this is the same Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman, and Miller, who is still active. He's still over there, I think, in Stanford, who does some remarkable work. So he was Kahneman's student. And I think in 1986, they came out with a paper, a very influential paper, thousands of citations, called norm theory. And they described that scenario over there. And I thought this is terrific. Probably somebody did a replication on this. So I was looking at all the thousands of citations, and nobody did a direct replication of this in exactly the same way that they did in there. So I decided I'm going to start from these targets, Kahneman and Miller 1986, hitchhiker scenario, car accident scenario. So the hitchhiker scenario you saw already. And then Dale Miller, it's the same Miller as here, in the same year, together with McFarland, did another one, which was the robbery scenario, which you also saw. So actually, I started from these two. The first one had a choice, dichotomous choice, and the other one had two conditions within design and a continuous variable, dependent variable. Now, at the beginning, when I was at postdoc, I was supposed to guide students, master students. It was the first time in my life that I ever guided students. And these students, I said I will only guide students on one of two things, either a pre-registered replication or a pre-registered meta-analysis. And from all the master's students at Maastricht University, only 4 students chose to work with me. But the nice thing is that they can select their preference. They all selected me to be their first preference because they really wanted to try and address the science crisis and understand what's going on. And they were excited by the prospect of doing a replication. So they came to me and they said, so great, how do we do a replication? How do we do a pre-registration? And I said, I have no idea, but let's try this out together. So the first brave soul was Lucas Kucher over here. So Lucas came to me and we talked about this and we decided to start from these two. But Lucas had some criticism. So he came to these papers and he noticed that although here in the classroom we evaluated regret, he saw that in Miller and McFarland, rather than looking at regret, who regrets things more, the DV, the dependent variable, was compensation. Compensation means that who do you think should get more compensation over the bad outcome of being shot? Lucas said, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Why did they measure this instead of regret? Because norm theory from 1986 talks about regret. So I said, perfect. Let's do this instead of just a pre-registered replication. Let's do this a pre-registered replication an extension. So after you do the replication, you go to the next page. So you don't touch the replication, you go to the next page and you add another dependent variable. So first we measure compensation just like they did. And then in the next page, we add one more question that asks about regret. And I'm very glad that we did this because the results for this was that when we measured regret and we used the dichotomous choice, actually this replicated very well. But when we used compensation, the replication failed. We were very surprised with this because this has been cited many, many times. So we're a bit confused, but then we checked the extension. So what happened when the extension, just like in this classroom, when we ran the extension was successful. So when we measured regret, which is what the original theory really hypothesized, things worked out. When we measured compensation, didn't really work out very well. So we emailed Dale Miller. We asked a lot of people who were in this domain, and we asked them, you know, funny thing happened. We tried both regret and compensation, and we can't get the compensation to work. And I said, yes, we ran compensation and we tried to get this published. People said, no, doesn't work for you, but it worked in 1986, therefore it's published already. First of all, not interesting because you're doing exactly the same thing somebody else did. Second of all, if you didn't get this to work, your problem, probably you're doing something incorrectly, even if it's the original author. So the amazing thing from 1986 until Lucas Kutcher in 2017 could be that people have been trying compensation again and again and not getting the results, which is very sad. Why don't we try and replicate things sooner? Why don't we repeat things? And when we can't find this, why don't we publish these? In addition, Lucas added a bunch of other things. So for example, he measured social norms and negative affect and perceived like. And this is kind of like what you will do. So when you will look at your replication, sometimes you will read things and you will ask yourself, why is this measure that actually doesn't make a lot of sense? Somebody asked me in the Slack, what is methods? What is rigor? What is design? So there's all sorts of things that the original targets did in their, in their design, in their study. Some of it seems like it matches with the hypothesis, it matches with the theory. Some of it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I want you, just like we were trying in the first 4 weeks, to put on the scientist hat and get into this mindset of, do these scholars really measure what it is that they're saying that they're measuring? So to see a match between the hypothesis and the study design and the actual methods and the test that was done. So I thought this is brilliant. Now, funny thing that also happened that year is that Lucas at the beginning of the first session that we sat together, he asked me, you know, I really wanted to do pre-registered replication and extension. However, is anybody going to be interested in this? And even before we did any data collection, I told them, I really don't know. This is the first time that I'm doing a pre-registered replication, but there's a social website, kind of like a Facebook for academics called ResearchGate, which you open an account on when you did the course syllabus quiz. Go on the website and write. So this is February 11, 2017. The aim of this project is to conduct a pre-registered replication and a meta-analysis on how past behavior norms affect perceived regret on a negative outcome. And so this is February 11. To my great surprise, a month later, this is March 28, dear Lucas and Gilad, at Cognition and Emotion, where Klaus and I are incoming editors. So an editor of a journal that's very well known, Cognition and Emotion, went on ResearchGate to comment on a post by one of my students before we did anything, saying, we are seeking to publish more pre-registered research. Please consider Cognition and Emotion to be an outlet for this project. So from thinking nobody cares about replication and nobody will ever publish this, suddenly before we did anything, just by him going on ResearchGate and posting this, suddenly an editor, a big guy from VU Amsterdam, comes in and invites us to submit. So next session, the next lab session, Lucas comes and he's very excited about this. Hold on, he's very excited about this. And he asked, okay, so we're going to get our paper published and we haven't even done anything yet. And I said, oh, hold on just a second. I know how difficult things are. There's a long process of reviewers. We need to go through things. We need to convince everybody that what we're doing is important and that we've done a good job. And this is a very, very simple experiment. You've seen how simple it is. We were able to demonstrate this within a few seconds in a classroom. Is this going to get published or not? So Lucas did an amazing job. And finally, to everybody's great surprise, indeed, cognition, emotion, the impact of past behavior and normality on regret. Lucas is a lead author on this. So amazing. From a one-year master's thesis, he was able to do a pre-register replication and extension with some really interesting insights. So 1986 until 2017, no published extension that actually works, and people who've been trying to do compensation again, perhaps not succeeding. Now, hopefully, will help the literature a little bit to kind of adjust. You wanted to ask something?
Yeah, so I think you're well aware of the representation bias, like before you did all any of this. So let's say if that editor hadn't contacted you guys, would you still think you have worked on this kind of representation goal? Because you know that's a those people who academics, right?
Yeah, we were very lucky. I was hoping to submit this at some point, but I wasn't sure who is going to listen to us. 2017, still not a lot of replication. Only starting out, and usually in order to get a replication published, you would need to be a big name. And people need to assume that you don't have any agenda or not going against anybody. And it's very important that you are very transparent, open science, 100%, plus pre-registration. I was very worried about other things because I didn't know how to do a replication and I didn't know how to pre-register. I also didn't know, talking about OSF as being a bad platform, how do you share stuff well? If you go to this project, actually now when I go and I see what we did over there, I cringe a little bit. It's like, oh my God, this is not good. But I can tell you what we did in 2017 is still so much better than some of the stuff that other scholars are doing today. But I'm very glad that Lucas joined with me on this, but we didn't know. We were very lucky. One of the other nice things about open science is that if you communicate things clearly, so before we did data collection, before we did anything, I went on ResearchGate. I also am very active on Twitter, and I write. So we're planning to do this and that. Who wants to help? Who wants to keep updates? Today I did this for your projects, for your applications. I was trying to get people excited about your targets. And I was asking who wants to help the students review. And hopefully some people will sign up from this. And we also have a team of 50 that will give you some feedback. So when you communicate things and when you're open about what you're doing, eventually you'll find somebody who might be interested. So if we wouldn't write this on ResearchGate, I don't know if we'll ever find Sandor Core, cognition and emotion. In addition, Lucas didn't only do a pre-registered replication, he also did a pre-registered meta-analysis. Amazing, in a one-year master's to do both a pre-registered replication and a pre-registered meta-analysis means that he went through the entire literature in order to see everybody who has ever done this sort of thing, and he tries to summarize this. And remarkably, what we did in a pre-registered replication and what we did in a pre-registered meta-analysis kind of fit together. Here, I'll show you. So he summarized all the possible dependent variables. So you can see regret over here, you can see counterfactual thought, and you can also see victim compensation. And over here, we see the number of studies. So 25 studies measured regret, only 6 measured compensation. And then you have the Cohen's D or Hedges G, the effect size. So the effect size is much larger for regret and much lower for compensation, which was here. So 0.66 compared to 0.39. So the nice thing about this is that now we need to know that when we're doing a power analysis, if we really want to detect effects with compensation, we need larger samples, or we need to compensate for this in order so that we're powered enough. So there's definitely an effect size difference in the very biased literature. So there is a publication bias, but even with the publication bias, if somebody ever bothered to do a meta-analysis of all the literature, comparing regret to compensation, they will see that there is a difference in effect size. So if we only had the meta-analysis, perhaps you would say, publication bias or some other problems. If we only had the pre-register replication, we'd say, okay, you ran this on a number of participants online. First time you ran this, perhaps it's not representative. These two together, now we can see a clear pattern that if you measure regret, it's much closer to the theory. Compensation, there's probably a lot of other things and noise in that system. So very interesting findings over here from all sorts of directions. The way that we did this is that Lucas graduated, and then Adrian came in and helped us with some coding. And finally, once again, cognition and emotion. So cognition and emotion has been very friendly towards the first attempts that we had at doing open science. So both pre-registered replication and extension plus a pre-registered meta-analysis, which is what we aim to do. Plus, this was very rare back at the time, definitely 2017, even 2020. You can see that when we write the abstract, we summarize everything. At the end, we also add all materials are available on the OSF. We do this for a number of reasons. First of all, we support open science and we want to share all of our data in the code. But there's another reason. I'm sharing this with you. Publishers are preventing you from reading, having access to what it is that you paid for. So you pay us, you fund our research, and then unless you're at the University of Hong Kong, but let's say your parents go and try and read the article, they can't access this unless they pay a bunch of money. In the OSF, we upload our preprints before they're edited. So if it's in the abstract, everybody can see the abstract because that's public. So even if they don't have the actual article, they can click on the OSF link, go to the OSF and read the preprint before it's edited and count. So another way of doing open science is also supporting open access. So everybody can go and access everything that they paid for with their money, taxpayers' money. So that's another reason. So you'll see that every time we share everything, it's not only the data in the code, but we also share the preprints. Preprints are very, very important. Nowadays, we also have some preprint servers. So we upload everything to ResearchGate. That's commercial. We also update things to all sorts of archives supported by the OSF. But this is really key so that anybody who's interested in our research can have access to that.
Also a question.
Yes.
So in that case, I imagine it is that so when someone buys your article,
Yeah.
like I think the original authors are going to come. That's how I imagine it.
Never.
Oh, never?
Absolutely not.
It's like kind of like I keep on like there are some articles that I can't access to the university library. And it kind of like pay something like $10 to access an article for like 8 hours, and none of that actually goes to the law.
Now let's go to the original office. The only thing that might happen is that some journals are affiliated with some societies. For example, the Association for Psychological Science might get some support in order to run some conferences and reduce some of the costs. But in any way, publishers are among the most profitable businesses in the world today. There are 6 publishers that make a lot of money. The profit margin is about 30%. So IT companies have something like 6% margin. They have 30% plus margin, and they contribute absolutely nothing, and they're standing their way of us doing good research. A game. Have you heard of the Monty Hall game? You're probably, Monty Hall. So if you've heard of this game, please don't share your insights. Let others kind of think about this. All right. Let's open the game. All right. So we're faced with 3 doors. I'll first ask you. Sorry.
I didn't recognize the name. I just somebody.
Yeah, it's a famous game, right? So you have 3 doors. Behind one of those is a car, or in this case, Mentos. And in the other 2, there's a goat, so you get nothing. Anybody want to play with me? This game? I need a volunteer. Yes. Okay. So which one? The left, the middle, or the right? Okay. So you chose the right. Now I'm opening one of the doors to show you that one of the other 2 that you did not choose has a goat, or in this case, nothing. So the question is, do you want to stick with your original choice, or do you want to switch to the other door? Sorry? Stay with the same one? You want the car? Congratulations.
No other game. I just don't play the game.
Huh?
Because I want mentals, but I know the game. Yeah, so like, yeah. Okay, sure, I'll play.
You want to go next? Okay. Sorry.
Three mentals. Yeah.
Which one? Which door?
The right one.
The right one?
Yeah.
You
And
want-
I'll switch.
You switch? Congratulations. Anybody else?
Thank you. My calorie.
Anybody else? There's a point to this. There's a point to this. But I do need some more volunteers. Yes? Okay. Let's play.
Oh, the middle door.
The middle one. Do you stick or you switch?
Switch.
You switch.
Yeah.
You got the car.
You have coke. I could use switch mentals.
Oh, okay. I'll get you one in the break.
No.
One more. One more. One more. Want to play? I'll let you in the back. You want to play with me? Yeah. Yeah. Which door? The right one? Do you stick or you switch? Switch. I'm sorry. All right. So what's the point of the game? What's the point of the game? Let me ask you, just one second. Let me just ask you. When you did not get the Mentos or the car, how did you feel? Everybody wins. You think I collaborated with the website in order to make everybody win all the time? Surprise. Anything else? Huh? Okay. Do you think you made a wrong decision, or if we play just the game, you'll make another decision? If you switch, you have a larger probability.
Yeah.
If he switches, does he have a larger probability?
Yeah.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah.
Because I can show you reports from math experts, mathematicians who have published thousands of papers telling you that you're wrong.
Or down.
Okay, let's put this to a vote. How many people think that switching has a higher probability? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you think that it has same probability? Same probability? Can you explain maybe? Can you explain? You're not sure? Just your intuition? Okay. Can you explain? You're not sure either? Can you explain your hypothesis?
And
So it's stuff that's in your head, you know these by heart, or it's based on something that you heard before.
I heard.
Oh, you heard before, so you trusted some source to tell you that this is the right way to go.
Yeah.
Okay, but it is based on your intuition, based on something that somebody told you. And yours is an intuition not based on something that somebody told you. Okay. Something you want to say? In your high school? Okay. Your math teacher said that?
I don't know if that. I remember there's like.
What's his or her name?
But I don't know if it's which one.
Well, you don't remember which one is the first one? All right.
Like, I just do.
That's the thing. I want to show you that this is a very controversial thing, and a lot of people. Died. You don't hear me on that? They heard me? Okay. Can you do me a favor? So I'm going to show you just how controversial this is. And a lot of people have been debating this for a very long time. So we'll start with a clip.
Yeah, Santiago, settle a little tiff that Kevin and I are having.
Let's be honest, Raymond, it's not a tiff, it's a row.
And now it's a scene.
That's okay, sir. We don't want to get involved in your personal life.
It's not personal, it's a math problem.
Pass.
Raymond and I had dinner together last night for the first time in 2 weeks, thanks to the night shift.
And Kevin thought it would be fun to spoil our date with an inane math problem, to which his answer is wrong.
Enough foreplay. Let's get to the numbers.
It's the Monty Hall problem. Imagine you're on a game show. There are 3 doors, behind one of which is a car.
You're telling it wrong. There are 3 doors, behind one of which is a car. You pick a door. The host, who knows where the car is, opens a different door, showing you there's nothing behind it. Now the host asks if you'd like to choose the other unopened door. Should you do it?
No.
Yes.
It's simple math. It doesn't make any sense to switch. The prize is behind one of 2 doors. It's a 50-50 chance either way.
It's 2/3 if you switch, 1/3 if you don't. The probability locks in when you make the choice. We've been over this 8 times.
7 times. Now you can't even do simple addition.
Kevin is right.
You're fired.
What? Good evening, sir.
No, it's not. I haven't slept because I've been going over that stupid problem. Now I finally understand Kevin's side.
Cool, so it's all better and I never have to hear about math again?
Quite the opposite. I know better than ever how incorrect he is. Probability doesn't kick in. Do I have to teach you college-level statistics?
I don't know. Do I have to teach you high school statistics?
Do I have to teach you 8th grade statistics?
Do I have to teach you 7th grade statistics?
Do I have to teach you... No,
As you can see, there's a lot of controversy about this. It even made it to Brooklyn 99. We solved the problem at the end. Oh, you watched this episode? What? Okay.
Well, let me talk about their solution in class.
Okay, yeah. So let's say that we have this debate and we have a lot of people, the side that's heard from someone and the side that's intuitive, and then the high school teacher. How do we make sense of this? Let's say that you want to seek out information. You want to know which one is the true one. What do you do? Okay, how do you run a simulation?
Run each condition, run keeping with that choice and switching to choice, run it about 300 times each and see what happens. Why don't you do it 200 or 300 times when you're in a simulation? You can do it for 1,000,000 times. Well, at least 2 or 3. But you don't want to compute this at all.
So if needed, you can write this kind of thing?
I could.
In what?
I don't want to, but I could. I don't want to, I could.
Okay, yeah. So a simulation is a very good way to address this thing. Interesting thing that happened to me today. After lunch, I sat in the turtle pond. Did you know that there's a turtle pond at HKU? Did you know? Yeah, just next to the law building. I'm amazed that there are some scholars who have been here for 20 years, and I tell them about I was sitting next to the turtle pond and like, what turtle pond? Let's see, it's turtle pond. And I was listening to an audiobook, and it's an audiobook that came out this week by Steven Pinker. Do you know Steven Pinker? So he's considered to be one of the great thinkers in social psychology / language. He did a lot of research about all sorts of things. So for example, over here, you can see that in the year 2003, he came out with the language instincts, or how the mind works. Each one of them is more than 10,000 citations. He's considered to be, he talks about the importance of rationality, rational thought, progressiveness, how the world improves over time. He became quite controversial because of all sorts of books, especially this one that came out, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. I think that he does a really good job at communicating these things to the general public. I think he does a really good job at summarizing very complicated literatures about human nature, humankind, progress, how we make sense of things. And I think he's a very strong advocate for science. There's all sorts of things that people have debates with him about, but it's good to have a debate. At least, he has a very clear way of thinking about things. This is the book that came out, Steven Pinker, Rationality, What It Is, What It Seems, Why It Seems Scarce, Why It Matters. Do you know how to read this sort of thing from Google Scholar? Do you know what this is? Cited by So number of citations, he's been cited more than 100,000 times. The H index, what is an H index? Yeah, how to read this? He has an H index of 100. What does this mean? Okay, you either know or you don't. It's not like a big test, but it is about a reputation and about impact. So he has more than 100 articles that he has published that have more than 100 citations. If you have an H index of 200, then you have 200 articles of 200 citations. That's how it works. This I-10 index means that he has 312 articles with more than 10 citations. 10 citations generally means that somebody noticed you. So a lot of the things don't ever get citations. A lot of the thesis and stuff that we publish, nobody ever reads. If you got to 10 citations, it means somebody read and cited your work. So he has 312. So that's very prolific. In a 30-year career, means more than 10 articles or books a year. So that's pretty amazing. So very impactful person. Why am I mentioning him in the turtle pond? So I was listening to this today. It turns out that there's a chapter over there that talks about the Monty Hall dilemma. So I really like it that Steven Pinker was actually using this in order to demonstrate the importance of rationality. And he has the most amazing case study that after I listened to this during lunch, I went to find whether I can show this to you. And to my great surprise and delight, turns out that he has shared his course Rationality with the entire public. So I can show you, because this book is based on his course, I can show you the part where he shares how people reacted to the Monty Hall problem and how this relates to rationality. I really recommend, if you don't like my irrationality course or the common core that we have over here, Steven Pinker, it's really nice to hear from some of the greatest minds in our field about the course. So you're welcome to go visit this here. It was only announced in January that you can take Steven Pinker's Harvard Intro to Psych class for free. So that's nice. I'm going to show you 2 minutes from how he discusses the Monty Hall problems and how this relates to our cases here. Hopefully this will work.
Problem became famous was when it was featured in a column in Parade magazine. If any of you get the Boston Globe or any other local newspaper on a Sunday, it will come with a color supplement magazine called Parade magazine. For many years, there was a column by a woman named Marilyn Vos-Savant, sometimes touted as the world's smartest woman because she took an IQ test and she was off the scale. Now, she would have various problems and puzzles and examples in her column, and she did not originate the Monty Hall problem, but she ran it in one week in 1990. And she said, you should switch. The first door has a 1/3 chance of winning, but the second door has a 2/3 chance. She received 10,000 letters, of which 1,000 came from PhDs, mostly in mathematics and statistics. And I will just give you a sample of 3 of these letters that she got. You blew it, and you blew it big. Since you seem to have difficulty grasping the basic principle at work here, I'll explain. After the host reveals a goat, you now have a 1 in 2 chance of being correct. Whether you change your selection or not, the odds are the same. There is enough mathematical illiteracy in this country, and we don't need the world's highest IQ propagating more shame. Scott Smith, PhD, University of Florida. Here's another one. I am sure you will receive many letters on this topic from high school and college students. Perhaps you should keep a few addresses for help with future columns. W. Robert Smith, PhD, Georgia State University. And, of course, maybe women look at math problems differently from men. Don Edwards, Sun River, Oregon. It gets worse. Some of you may have heard of Paul Erdős, who is described in Wikipedia as a renowned Hungarian mathematician, one of the most prolific of the 20th century. And in a bit of nerdy pride, many scientists, mathematicians, and graduate students in math-related fields Feldman-Erdős number. That is the number of co-authored publications that link them to a co-authored publication with Paul Erdős, because he authored more than 1,500 papers in mathematics during the 20th century. Now, Paul Erdős refused to believe it. He clung to the wrong answer. He was only convinced not when it was even shown to him mathematically, but when he saw a computer simulation that had the Let's Make a Deal game played hundreds of times, and he could count up the results. Now,
so this is quite remarkable. So even when you run simulations, even if you show equations, even if you explain this to people, even people with PhD in mathematics, even some of the most prolific people in the mathematics field, you explain this to them, are unable to accept the proof for this and keep sticking with their original answer. So he discusses whether this is rational or not, and how do we deal with this human tendency to not obey what it is that we are proven, but instead follow our instincts, our intuitions, and all of that. Now, since you mentioned simulations, we should show a simulation. I think he's really eloquent and really clear about things. I like his his clarity of mind, his ability to articulate some complicated notions. Now, there's a simulation in R. If you want, you don't have to write this yourself. You can actually go. There's lots of people. That's the nice thing about open source, open access, open science. Other people have done this. Actually, you can go and Paul van der Laken. You can go on his website and see this sort of thing. So if you play this many, many times, you actually see that it's 2/3 against 1/3. At the beginning, it's not really clear what's going on, but over time, if you play this again and again, many, many times, it kind of becomes a very clear pattern. Then it's 1/3 to 2/3. A way to simulate this, so if we go back to the, where was this? Here. The nice thing about this is this has a simulation tab, so we can actually simulate this. How many did you want? 1 million?
Yeah.
No, we don't have time for that. But we'll do something as close. So if we keep the choice and we do this not fasting, we want instant, and we start the simulation, it goes really, really fast. But you can see that over time, it's kind of like around 1/3, right? That you get the car or you get the Mentos. And if you do the change and you simulate this 1,000 times, then it gets to like 2/3 of that. So it's nice because, you know, in the age of the era of internet, we don't have to code anything ourselves. We can have a look at the code. I actually went through the code of the R in order to try and understand whether they've done things correctly. And then I ran this, and I was convinced. But even if we don't have this, I really like it when we try to clarify things by simplifying things. So we can do simulations. That's very convincing. But actually, Steven Pinker, including the video that I'll show you right now, tries to do this by showing simple steps. So you don't need to be a mathematician. You don't need to trust anybody, but you can make some calculations that are very, very simple for you to gain the right answer. So let's see this person, and then we'll take a break.
This place isn't a paradise, it's a prison. Out here.
Or switch. Well, a remarkable thing about this problem, simple as it is that it has sparked just endless debate. In the time of the show, I don't recall anybody ever saying there was a dedicated strategy that you should always follow. But in fact, there is a dedicated strategy you should follow. You should pick door number 3. That's the answer. You should switch. You should switch every time, and that will do the best for you over the long run. So there is a 1/3 chance that the car is behind the door you picked initially. That means there must be a 2/3 chance, much greater, twice as big, that the car is somewhere else. And since we know that somewhere else cannot be door number 2, because Monty showed us that, it's got to be over here. So this is what you should choose. You should switch. Twice as likely to have the car behind the door that you didn't pick as the door that you did. 2/3.
Now, okay, this we could have done ourselves, but still it's not very convincing. How to make this even more simple so that anybody can see what the right answer is? I really like what she does next.
2/3 probability to a 1/3 probability. Now, if you switch, are you guaranteed to win? Absolutely not. But if you play this game over and over again, on average, you will win 2/3 of the time. So switch is your strategy, and you can't beat it. One thing that you might say is that the initial 2/3 chance that the car was behind door number 2 and door number 3 got concentrated behind the door that Monty did not open. That's effectively what's happening. That's intuitively what's happening. And that, in fact, is what the mathematics shows is happening. Now, there is a way to see that in kind of a more grand way. If we imagine not having 3 doors, but we imagine having 100 doors. And let's imagine that we're playing this.
So you can substitute the first problem with a different problem that clarifies much better what needs to be done here in order to get the right.
Same kind of game. We have Monty over here. He is going to give you an opportunity to pick a door, and your dream flashcar is behind one of these 100 doors, but there are 99 zonks all behind the other doors. Now, what is it that you're going to do? Well, you're going to pick a door. Say again, you pick door number 1. Now, you're feeling a little bit different than you might have felt in the case where there were 3 doors, because there you thought, wow, I've got a 1 in 3 chance. Here you're thinking, I've got a 1 in 100 chance. I'm not going to get that car. It's not behind door number 1. It's probably behind one of the other 99 doors. What Monty does is he opens 98 of those 99 doors. He shows you 98 zonks, and he asks you, now, do you want to switch? Well, maybe.
Does this help clarify the situation? So now it becomes a lot simpler to see that the right choice is to switch.
Just because of the sheer numbers, this thing is a little clearer. You know that there was 99 out of 100 chance that the car was over here, and now the only door you're left with after Monty shows you all those zonks is door, say, number 37, and you're thinking, this is no good, this is no good, all those doors are no good. Do I want to stay with 1 or do I want to stay with 37? You can sort of almost feel the concentration of that 99% going behind door number 37, and so you switch over here.
All right, so that's a lot about Monty Hall problem, and we'll talk when you come back from the 5-minute break about how this is related to our research. So let's take 5. Kahneman and Tversky, 1982. Came up with this scenario. So think about this and tell me, it's a little bit similar to the exceptionality effect that we started with. You have George and Paul and their investors. Paul and George invested $1 million US. And then after they've invested this in one, the decision is whether they should switch or not switch to a new investment. Now, one of them, George, switched and Paul didn't switch. And the outcome was both of them lost $200,000 US. The question is, who feels higher regret? So once again, we're looking at regret, and we're trying to assess which one of them will feel a higher regret. You have 2 of them, they've made exactly the same decision at the beginning, but then one of them switched and one of them didn't switch, and the outcome is exactly the same. Both of them lost an amount of money. Which of them feels higher regret? What's your intuition?
Do they know anything about the Bitcoin?
Sorry?
Like the math behind it?
This is not Monty Hall. This is a different thing.
Oh.
So they had an investment. This is a real life scenario. You're an investment firm. You had $1 million US that you invested in something. Then you had a decision whether to switch to a different investment or keep your investment. And then at the end of the year, when you look at how much you've gained or lost, both of them lost 200,000. So not related to Monty. We'll connect this to Monty in a second. But of these 2, in this scenario, who feels stronger regret? Oh, there seems to be some agreement here. 92% of people said that Action George is likely to have stronger regret, which leads to, when there's the possibility of a negative outcome, people tend to stick to what it is that they've already decided, because if they switch, they're thinking, maybe I will regret switching or taking action. I should have just stayed with what it is that I chose before. So back then in 1982, this seemed to be like a very surprising finding, because Homo economicus says that it shouldn't really matter whether you switch or didn't switch. The outcome is exactly the same. So it should be about 50-50. So here we compare 92-8 to 50-50, a very significant effect. Something here is off, and the homo economicus assumption of it doesn't matter clearly is not right. Action leading to a negative outcome leads to higher regret, which leads to people changing the way that they do things. So when faced with an option of switching and not switching, people tend to not take action and not switch. In Monty Hall, even though it's very clear, if you show simulations and you run the math, that people should switch. And still, even when people are told this, they tend to not switch. They're staying with their own pre-selected option. So there's some links between what Kahneman and Tversky did back then and what the Monty Hall is, and then many other things in our life. And I'm going to show you some practical implications of all of that. All right, so you can take that Kahneman and Tversky from 1982 and switch this to take this to a different Monty Hall paradigm. And then if the initial door was door one, which is like the investment of $1 million, and George switched and Paul didn't switch, the outcome is both of them did not win the car. We're faced with a goat. Who feels higher regret? So George, who switched, is going to feel higher regret, which leads to more people not switching, even if they're told that this is the right thing to do. Now, it turns out that there's an academic paper on this. So actually, if you want to study things like the Monty Hall problem, you can do that. This is a very impactful paper that was done by Gilad, who studied this in many different ways. Do people reduce dissonance more than errors commission from the errors of omission? So commission is inaction and omission is action. So to answer this question, the authors created a laboratory analog of the 3 doors of Monty Hall problem. Subjects initially selected one box from the group of 3, only one of which contained a grand prize. After the experimenter opened one of the 2 unchosen boxes and revealed the modest prize, subjects were asked to decide whether to stay from the initial selection or trade it in for another unopened box. Unlike what was done here with the website, where it was a real selection, actually the experimenters manipulated the outcome. And whatever it is that they did, whether they switched or didn't switch, they made sure that they don't get the grand prize, but they get the modest prize. So regardless of the subject's choice, a modest prize was received. Results indicated the subjects who switched boxes assigned a higher monetary value to the modest prize that they received than those who stayed with their initial choice. So people compensated themselves by attributing higher value in order to overcome their regret about switching. This is how they framed this paper. Yes, please.
Is it possible to use this to explain the default effect? Because switching away from the default is also an action.
Exactly. This is coming up in a few slides. So exactly the paper that you're reviewing, it's one of the papers that we looked at, the many aspects of action in action. One of them is a default effect. Since you've mentioned this, do you want to tell the class what is default? What does it mean, a default?
Okay, so basically, default effect is I think we reviewed this in class though.
Who reviewed?
Didn't you show this example in class?
Which example?
The organ donor. Oh wait, no, you didn't know. Oh, sorry. Okay, so basically.
But Daniel is going to introduce this in a few minutes. So so it's good.
Okay.
But before Daniel in organ donation, what is a default?
So default is that. So let's say when you're going to take a survey, what do you want to eat for dinner, let's say, and then the first option is curry, and then the second option is cup noodle, and then the first option was selected already, so that was the default. So whatever option.
Okay, selected.
Yes.
So putting all the noodles aside,
yes,
you have some options, and one of them is pre-selected.
Yes.
And this is the default.
No, people are more likely to stick with the default.
Yes, people are more likely to stick with the default. So if something is pre-selected for you, you tend to just go along with it. What are some possible explanations for this?
So one of them is the owner endowment effect, where people think that this was the option that was given to them, the only option. So
Okay.
they want to switch to a different one.
Uh-huh.
Another one was the one that we just discussed about, which was regret.
Mm-hmm.
There was another one, I think it was the experimenter expectation theory.
No, it's not. If this was pre-selected for me, probably somebody knew what the right decision is, therefore I will just go with it. very good. So we'll come back to this. But action in action actually has a lot of ways in order to examine this. And defaults is one of the ways. So whenever we think about action in action, it's in reference to something. And in this case, it's in reference to the defaults. Am I going to change from the default, or am I going to stick with the default? So change from the default is action, stick with the default is inaction. What other ways are there to think about action in action? What other things?
Probably one way you could think about it is
Mhm.
you could say that it's because that person's preferences on that level.
Exactly. Okay, so can you give me an example, something concrete?
So because if you're given the option of like going out to eat and then your mom tells you, hey, do you want to get like sushi or ramen or maybe some very two kind of similar, and you don't really have a preference for either one of them, though they're both Japanese. So it's like if you're given an option between two things and you don't really have that much of a preference for either one of them.
Right.
If somebody else comes to say, hey, wait, if like for example, my little sister comes up and say, hey, I want sushi today, I probably wouldn't say, hey, let's switch, because it's that kind of thing that where you just kind of go along with the default,
Right.
because you don't want to bother changing the option because that expense extra into it.
Compared to?
Compared to just going along with it, I guess.
Yeah, so compared to the when you have a preference, what happens?
It's like a source of inertia where you'll just go along
Yeah.
with whatever happens.
I've had
unless your
pizza. My preference is pizza. Now you want to have sushi. I prefer going to the pizza. That's
unless your preferences are strong enough that they overcome. that.
okay. So past behavior and a preference is something that can influence whether you switch or not switch, right? So very, very good. So we have a lot of ways of thinking about action in action. So from something very simple that started in 1982, funnily led to a Nobel Prize and all that, a lot of people built up on that with default effects, past behavior, and exceptionality. So lots of links from all sorts of directions. So let me just show you. So we've done a bunch of replications on this, so we know that this works from a number of different angles. So for example, here for decisions resulting in negative outcomes, action is regretted more than inaction when social norms are for inaction. So with Lucas, one of the first replications was exceptionality effect. So whether exception against routine. And then in the same year, so this is 2017, again, we did this action versus inaction. And then the nice thing that you can see when you do replications and extensions is that sometimes it's like, this is very similar. So perhaps we can manipulate this so that they'll talk about the same thing. So maybe we can take both exceptionality and action in action and see how they fit together. In another paper that came out here is where we manipulated both exceptionality. So exceptionality both in terms of past behavior, was it action or inaction? Or in terms of the expectations, does your friend expect you to switch or not switch? Or the society, is a society that emphasizes action or inaction? And we showed all these interactions. So both for action, inaction, and exceptionality, they seem to be strong effects and they impact one another and they interact. Yeah, so we tried to map all the types of action in action in the literature, and we came up with a lot. Default effects are definitely in here. So there's default bias. There's also status quo bias. There's action effect, inaction effect, omission bias we'll talk about next week. Action principle of harm, action inertia, inaction inertia. So it seems like at least here, there are 8 different phenomena in the literature that different scholars studied without talking to each other. So there's a whole literature on default bias. There's a whole literature on status quo bias. There's a whole literature which started everything about action effect, but they never looked at the links. One of the nice things about the project that we're doing here at HKU is we're mapping, we now have 100 of these, and we're among the first who are able to see all kinds of links between those. And that's how we're able to do these kinds of mappings. So we've mapped the action in action domain. You're looking at the default bias effect. Some of you are looking at the status quo bias. Some of you are looking at other elements over here. Some replications that you will do are linked to this, but there's some other domains as well that are looking at morality or the true self and other aspects of the judgment and decision literature. And then after we make sure that things are replicable and things are solid, we can put this into one sort of thing and then perhaps suggest what ties them together. And in this case, what ties them together seems like is norm theory. So I can't remember who said this at the beginning, but norm theory basically says there is a base and there are references to that. So everything is reference points, and it depends what the base is. The base is what has been pre-selected for you. The base could be the status quo, or what you've done in the past, or what the social norms are. But basically, all of these effects together, studied differently by different scholars, published in different places, can all come together using one theoretical framework, which has already been suggested in '86 by Kahneman and Miller, called norm theory. So it's all about reference points. So this is what we suggested here, and this kind of ties everything together. And it all started from a very, very simple paradigm of action versus inaction and exception versus routine. All right, this is a demonstration of the status quo bias. This is what they've done originally in the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and Boston University. So what they did over here is they had between subject designs. And you can see that if you give people the ability to choose between a moderate risk or a high risk, this is what they'll choose. These are kind of like the preferences. So about 60 people, this is the moderate. So you'll see the more high risk is like there's more possibility of a loss. And it's about 60-40. So if you just ask people without telling them anything, you inherited some money from your great uncle, which one would you invest in? But if we change this paradigm and say you've inherited some money, but it was already invested in the high risk company B, which one would you choose? So there was already a status quo, it was already done for you and pre-selected, then it switched from 40-60 to 56-44. So there's a switch of preferences, 60 to 44 to 63. So just playing around with the status quo, telling people what this has already been invested in, has changed people's preferences of whether they want to change what the status quo is or which choice they're going to choose here. Another example is with the safety commission, whether they should divide the budget between auto safety and highway safety. Once again, just playing around with the status quo from 53-47, went into 62-38, and then a complete reversal you see between just showing them what the status quo is and what he already was invested in. Now, another replication that we did was on the status quo bias. And the nice thing is that when you do replications of this kind of stuff, exactly like your replications, is that we try to do a very comprehensive replication of a few studies or a few scenarios. And when you do a replication, you notice that some things work and some things don't work. So generally, status quo bias seems to be a very robust and reliable effect, and we were able to replicate much of that. However, we found strong empirical support for the status quo bias in 3 decision scenarios out of the 4. So we failed to find substantial support for wagon color choice scenario. And in the replication, we can come up with a few ideas of why this might have happened, and we can help correct the literature. So it does seem like status quo works, but not in every context, and perhaps things changed over time. So one of the reasons why we do replications is not only to know, does this work or not work, but works under what circumstances, what needs to be updated, and what doesn't need to be updated. So this is just an example of what was done over there, and it's, you can see in scenario 1, very consistent. But then in scenario 2, no signal. So we repeated this again, once again, no signal. But when we ran scenario 3 and scenario 4, generally seemed like it was there was a signal and it was in the right direction. All right, all kinds of examples from real life. So I took these slides from practitioners. So if you go into firms, let's say, I think you see this already when you sign up for what people sign up today, Instagram, TikTok. Default effect definitely happens over there. So the default is just next, 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 next. Or if you go to Europe, everything over there is, do you accept the cookies? If you don't accept the cookies, you need to fill out a lot of forms just not to accept the cookies. So there's all sorts of things in order to create a situation where you're going to choose what it is that they want you to choose. So status quo bias is the reason why we eat Japanese food or noodles, or go to our favorite restaurant, eat the same breakfast, go to the same place on holiday, stick with the same phone operator. So as marketers or as IT companies or as whatever it is, finance decision makers that you'll be when you go into industry, you can use some of the things like default effect, like status quo bias, in order to try and affect the choice set about what people will do. This is what the companies and the corporates do. We, on our side in psychology, try to educate people that this is what companies do in order so that they protect themselves from that. So that they understand the consequences of what happens when they're faced with this kind of choice. So things like you mentioned organ donations, it's very important that people make good decisions about their pensions, about their health insurance. In Hong Kong, it's kind of taken for granted that you have health insurance, not so much in the US. I remember the mess of coming and working. I was at Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, in Tallahassee, Florida, in Florida State University. You're faced with an impossible choice between 20 health providers, and I'm one of the lucky ones that are giving health insurance by the university, where a lot of people in the US are not even entitled to that. So just by choosing what it is that your choice set is, so somebody, a choice architect, is presenting you choices in a certain way, can really affect the kind of decision that you will make. So if you come to Tallahassee, Florida to study Florida State University, and you're giving a choice of 20 different health insurers, what will you select? Most people don't select anything, because who wants to deal with a choice between 20 health insurers? So they are left with no health insurance. But if you go to Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, they also have 20, but they enroll you with a default. And then most people don't really switch from that default, but at least they have some health insurance. So just by the way that you play with a choice set, you can affect people's choices, and sometimes for the good, and with your marketing company, sometimes for the bad. So stay in the same career, go to the same bar, don't change our pension provider, stay loyal to the favorite crisps. So action in action, default bias, status quo bias, escalation of commitment, sunk costs, they all tie into the same kind of thing, but paradigms of action in action that have influences in all kinds of domains in our lives. Okay, we'll skip this. And now we get to the default bias, and we'll have Dana really explain organ donations to us.
So let's think about a few examples of decision illusions. This is my favorite plot in all of social science. It's a plot that shows some countries in Europe and how many people in these countries are interested in donating their organs after they pass away. Now, these are not the people who actually donate, because whether a desire to donate translates into real donation depends on how you die, what your family members want, and so on. But these are the people who are interested in it. Now, when you look at this plot, you see countries on the right that give a lot and countries on the left that give very little. And the question is why? Why do some countries give a lot and some countries give a little? And when I ask my students this question, they usually think it's about culture. After all, with regular gifts, you get to enjoy the act of gift giving. You get to give somebody a gift, you get to look at their appreciation in their eyes. With organ donations, not so much. You give it after you die to somebody anonymous. Or you could say maybe it's about culture, or maybe it's about the law, or maybe it's about religion. But mostly they think it's about caring about other people in your society. But here's the interesting thing. When you look at this list, you can see countries that we think about as very similar from a cultural, religious, legal perspective, behaving very differently. For example, Sweden is all the way on the right. Denmark is all the way on the left. Germany is in the left group. Austria is in the right group. Depending on where you are in the world, you either think of the UK and France as either similar or different. The closer you are, by the way, to those two countries, you think they're more different. But anyway, what you can see is that they are very different in terms of organ donation. And finally, the example I like the most to think about is the comparison between the Netherlands, Holland, and Belgium. Holland gives about 28%. Belgium gives almost 98%. Very similar countries. Now, what's interesting about this case is that the Netherlands got to 28% after huge effort. They mailed every citizen in the country a letter begging them to join the organ donation program. There was coverage on television, there was coverage in the radio, there was really lots of information out there. And we don't know how much it cost them, but you can imagine it was very, very expensive. And all it got them was 28%. What did Belgium do? By the way, I should tell you that Holland, the Netherlands, also did a reality TV show in which people who were about to die got to choose who they want to leave their organs to. It was very controversial, of course, and it went off the air rather quickly. But it clearly was a central focus of attention in the country. So anyway, so with all this effort, they got to 28%. You can ask yourself, what effort did Belgium do? How much money did they spend on it? And the answer is they spend zero. They spend much, much, much less than the Netherlands. So what does explain the difference between the countries on the left and the countries on the right? It turns out it's one little thing, which is the enrollment form. And here's the secret to this whole thing. Some countries, like the countries on the left, have a form that says, check the box if you want to participate in the organ donation program. And what do people do when they see this form? They do nothing. They don't check the box and they don't join the program. These are the countries on the left. The countries on the right have a slightly different form. It says, check the box below if you don't want to participate in the organ donation program. And what do people do in this second case? They do the same exact thing. They don't check, but now they join. Now we call this opt-in and opt-out, and this is also a question of what is the default choice. And this is really kind of an amazing phenomenon, and because of that, I think it's worthwhile spending a few minutes on this.
We're not going to go into this because it keeps going, but it's not about people not noticing. There's all sorts of ways by which we ensure that they actually pay attention and that they understand this, but they still go ahead and not select the option. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's quite robust. I'll just mention for this that this is actually taken from a presentation that was done by the students whose replication you're going over right now. And they've presented this in a very nice and appealing way. So you can see some of the options over there. Yes to be an organ donor, no not to be an organ donor, and no default. All sorts of default manipulations. Plus some playing with framing. Do not notify me about more health insurance. Yes, no, do not, no. So no to do not is yes. So all kinds of framing kind of differences and tricks that you can do just by designing this form. Eric Johnson, the person whose default effect you were mentioning before, is a person who talks about choice architecture. And it's not like we have the option of becoming choice architectures. We are choice architectures of our own lives all the time. We get to set the defaults for ourselves. How easy is it to grab this clothes over this clothes? How easy is it for us to get this food over this food? So if you're closer and your default is to have something more accessible that is less healthy, so you go for the less healthy. But you're the choice architect, so you can make sure that what's accessible to you or your default to go to is a more healthy option, is something that will protect you more. So you are the choice architect of your own options, but they've shown this in all sorts of different ways about organ donations and some other things. So this is a science paper published in Science, very, very influential. And this is the replication that you're going through. And actually, they found some really interesting things. Generally, they found support for default effect, but when it competes with framing effect, do not, actually framing effect seems to win over the default effect, which is a really interesting reframing of the whole phenomenon. So here you can see the original study found a very, very strong effect. Our replications found much smaller effects, but still effects that are meaningful. So this effect still holds. But when it competes with the framing effects in a different publication over here, then it seems like framing effects. You can see our replication over here, very, very strong effect for framing, and default didn't seem to hold as much. So default effect is important, but when competing with framing effects, at least in our replication, seems like framing effect was much stronger than that. Since you mentioned the meta-analysis, I'll just briefly say that Johnson, which is the kind of like the person, the thinker behind the default effect with his team, looked at the meta-analysis of 58 studies, and it seems like they've summarized the literature and did some publication bias estimates and shown that defaults have considerable effects on choice, and this is a fairly large effect size. This is Eric. For him as well, in the last month, a new book came out And I did not read the book yet. It's on my to-do list, but I listened to a few interviews, podcasts, and I really like the way that he talks about choice. Choice is everything. And you have the ability to construct your choice set in a way that you would make your life healthier, better, balanced, and all that. And he gives some practical examples of how to do that well. He's also a very good communicator and very interesting to listen to. Plus, he doesn't talk about other people's work. He talks about his own adventures with default bias and other related biases. And as you can see, he's also very impactful with a lot of publications on this, plus the default bias effect in the science paper. So I'll get around to reading this, but if there's something that you're interested in, default biases, action in action, these are some of the strongest, most consistent replicable effects that we'll see in this course and perhaps in the psychology literature. This is why I started from these. So for the action in action, for status quo, for default effects, all this big paradigm that I showed you surrounding norm theory, these are probably the most robust, consistent effects in the judgment and decision-making / social psychology literature. And from these foundations, we'll build on for other effects and phenomena in the following weeks. If you want, I'll stay here for a few more minutes. You can come talk to me, and I'll see you next week.